Guilty verdict in a brutal murder and helping kill his friend Antonio Barbeau's great-grandmother.
As you know, I love Austin.
Childhood is often associated with innocence, as children are free from vices like malice and hatred. But believe it or not, some kids from around the globe have committed crimes so horrifying that even the most hardened adult criminals would be astonished to hear about them. When children break the law, they are tried as juveniles, but there are times when courts decide to try them as adults, depending on the nature of their crimes. This means that child convicts are also handed down extremely long prison sentences, sometimes even life sentences. Most child criminals don't expect such severe punishments and are seen breaking down when their sentence is announced. Here are 15 longest life sentences given to kids. Number 1. Nikolas Cruz. Nikolas Cruz is the teenager who carried a firearm into the Parkland school and took the lives of 17 people. Cruz was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole after a jury failed to unanimously recommend the death penalty last year. The families of the victims were quite angered and disappointed by Cruz not receiving the death penalty. Broward Circuit Judge Elizabeth Scherer imposed the statutorily mandated sentence and ordered Nikolas to serve a life sentence with no possibility of parole for each of the 17 counts to which he had pleaded guilty. The sentences are supposed to run consecutively. Scherer also imposed a sentence of life in prison with a minimum of 20 years to serve on 14 of the 17 counts and life without the possibility of parole for the remaining 3 counts. Cruz will also not be able to financially benefit from the crimes he committed in any way. The judge also garnished his commissary funds until all costs and restitution were paid. After the sentencing, Cruz was ordered to be transferred to the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections. The months-long trial to decide Cruz's fate finally came to an end after 2 days of victim impact testimony in which the families of the survivors and the ones who died in the February 2018 shooting carried out by Cruz at the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in South Lake, Florida, spoke to the court. Through the testimony, Cruz remained emotionless. He was wearing a red prison jumpsuit and eyeglasses. He was also wearing a medical mask, but it was taken off when Jennifer Gutenberg, the mother of a 14-year-old victim, pointed out it was disrespectful of him to be hiding his expressions while all the families of his victims talked to him. Number 2. Antonio Barbeau. Antonio Barbeau was just 14 years old when he assaulted his grandmother with the help of a friend and took her life. He used a hatchet to attack the 78-year-old woman. Barbeau and his friend Nathan Papp were also found guilty by the court of taking the life of Barbara Olson in her Sheboygan, Wisconsin home. The unsuspecting old lady had invited her grandson and his friend inside, but as she turned her back to call Antonio's mother, he hit her on the head using the hatchet. Afterwards, he ran to the bathroom feeling sick, and when he came out, saw Pappy strike the woman using a hammer. Barbeau was sentenced to spend at least 36 years in jail back in 2013. He will be eligible for parole when he is 50 years old. Antonio tried to read an apologetic statement in court, but he could not hold back his tears and began crying. He passed it off to his attorney, who also had to fight back tears as he finished reading the statement. The judge said that this sentence was the minimum based on the crime, which was nothing short of horrific. Court held that Barbeau suffered a brain injury from his 2009 incident that left him an unspecified cognitive disorder, which played a role in his decision to commit a crime. However, the mental issue was not enough to disregard the horrific nature of the crime. Antonio's friend Pappy claimed that the robbery and assault were both Antonio's ideas. Once the 2 boys realized Olson was dead, they panicked and tried dragging her to the car, leaving a trail of blood through the house. But they failed to load her into the vehicle and dumped her in the garage. Afterwards, they allegedly stole several items, including a purse, loose change, and jewelry, before getting into Olson's car and speeding away. Number 3. Joshua Phillips. Joshua Earl Patrick Phillips was just 14 years old when he took the life of his 8-year-old neighbor, Maddie Clifton. Back in November 1998, the 14-year-old Joshua assaulted and took the life of his young neighbor and friend. The following year, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In a statement, Phillips revealed that he attacked Clifton to keep her from crying after she was accidentally struck by a baseball while they were playing, as he feared punishment from his abusive father. According to Phillips, he was home alone when Maddie, who lived across the road from him, came to his home and asked him to come outside to play. He agreed, although he wasn't allowed to have friends over when his parents were not home. While playing, he accidentally hit Maddie's eye with the ball. She began crying and screaming, and Phillips panicked, knowing his father would be home soon. He then dragged Clifton inside the house and struck her with the baseball bat before putting her under the base of his bed. He was arrested when his mother discovered Maddie's body in his room. Phillips was tried as an adult, and the trial was moved from Duval County to Polk County over concerns about the publicity in Jacksonville. Phillips' lawyer did not call a single witness for the defense and even discouraged his parents from testifying. Phillips also didn't speak during his trial, which lasted just 2 days. Jurors took just 2 hours to convict Phillips, who was later sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was not eligible for the death penalty as he was under the age of 16. Number 4. Roxana Sikorsky. Roxana Sikorsky was just 15 years old in October 2014 when she woke up in the middle of the night and assaulted her brother. She also attempted to off her parents and other siblings, but failed. Roxana was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison in 2016 when she was just 17 years old. Before her sentence was announced, Roxana's mother addressed the court and pleaded for mercy for her adopted daughter. Lauren Sikorsky said, "She's in desperate need of continued psychological help. She is still fragile, and an adult prison would shatter her delicate world. How will sentencing her as an adult help her? Is this justice?" Roxana was just 4 years old when the Sikorskys adopted her and her 2 siblings from Poland. Because of the abuse she suffered in early childhood, Roxana was diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, a mental illness in which children are unable to form an emotional attachment to their primary caregivers. The devastated teenager appeared genuinely sorry in court. She apologized to her parents for not being the daughter they wished she would be. Through tears, she said, "I promise I will get better no matter what happens." She took a plea deal, agreeing to plead guilty to 1 count of assault with intent to take someone's life in exchange for 6 other felony charges being dropped. The boyfriend who encouraged Roxana to commit such a heinous crime is serving a life sentence after being found guilty on 7 counts. Number 5. George Stinney. George Stinney Jr. was an African-American boy who was convicted for taking the lives of 2 young girls in March 1944 at the age of 14. He allegedly assaulted and took the lives of Betty June Bickner, who was just 11 years old, and Emma Thames, who was 7 in his hometown of Ellicott, South Carolina. George was convicted, sentenced to death, and executed by the electric chair in June 1944. He became the youngest American with an exact birth date confirmed to be sentenced to death and executed in the 20th century. The entire court proceedings against Stinney included the jury selection took place on April 24, 1944. His court-appointed counsel, Charles Plowden, a tax commissioner campaigning for election to local office, failed to challenge the 3 police officers who testified that Stinney confessed to the crimes. He also didn't challenge the 2 different versions of Stinney's verbal confession presented by the prosecution. Stinney was tried before an all-white jury that took just 10 minutes to deliberate and declared that the young boy was guilty. Judge Philip H. Stroll sentenced him to death by electrocution. Stinney's family, churches, and the NAACP appealed to Governor Olin D. Johnson for clemency, given his age, but the governor allowed the execution to proceed. A re-examination of Stinney's case began in 2004. Many people and the Northeastern University School of Law sought a judicial review. His conviction was vacated back in 2014, almost 70 years after his death. A South Carolina court ruled that he hadn't received a fair trial and was therefore wrongfully executed. Number 6. Lionel Tate. Lionel Alexander Tate is the youngest known American citizen ever sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was convicted for the 1999 battering death of 6-year-old Tiffany Eunick in January 2001 in Broward County, Florida. Tate was just 14 years old at that time. He was left alone with Tiffany, who was being babysat by his mother, Kathleen Grossett Tate. While the children were playing downstairs, Kathleen called for them to quiet down. Around 45 minutes later, Tate went to his mother and informed her that Tiffany was not breathing. He told her that while they were wrestling, he had her in a headlock and her head somehow hit the table. Tate was convicted of stomping on Tiffany so forcefully that her liver was lacerated. She also had serious bruises on her legs, feet, and neck. According to reports, the amount of force used on her was similar to bruises caused by a speeding car. The prosecution classified her injuries as similar to those she would have sustained by falling from a 3-story building. The judge sentenced Tate to life in prison, saying the acts of Lionel Tate were not playful acts of a child. The acts of Lionel Tate were cold, callous, and indescribably cruel. This sentence was considered quite controversial, as Tate was just 12 years old at the time and his victim was just 6. He was the youngest person in the modern U.S. to be sentenced to life imprisonment, and his punishment prompted criticism of the treatment of juvenile offenders in the justice system of the state of Florida. In 2004, Tate's conviction was overturned by a state appeals court on the basis that his mental competency hadn't been evaluated before his trial. Number 7. Jessica Carline. Jessica Carline is the young girl who crashed a car into the Wyoming Medical Center. The crash took the lives of 2 people. She was 17 at the time of the incident and pleaded guilty to 2 counts of vehicular homicide in court back in April 2015. In exchange for the guilty plea to both counts, the prosecution decided to seek no more than 16 years prison sentence to run concurrently. However, the judge was not obligated to accept the terms of the plea agreement, and according to investigators with the Casper Police Department, Carline was driving a vehicle eastbound on 2nd Street, approaching the Wyoming Medical Center. Her vehicle went over the curb and hit a sign in front of the hospital building and the building itself. Her passengers, Brandon Avery and Amanda Strickland, both of whom were 27, died as a result of the injuries they sustained in the crash. Later on, a can of air duster was found inside the vehicle, and her interview with police, Carline told the police that it made her high. It was also found that the vehicle was going as fast as 76 miles per hour at the time of the crash, and there were no signs that the brakes were used. No one in the car was wearing a seatbelt. Despite being 17 at the time of the collision, the prosecution charged Carline as an adult. Later in July 2015, Carline was sentenced to 12 to 16 years at the Wyoming Women's Center in Lusk. At her sentencing hearing, the parents of one of the victims said that the plea deal does not do justice. However, her defense argued that the victims took advantage of Jessica before the crash. She was ordered to pay more than $8,700 in restitution to the Department of Victim Services and to help cover the funeral and medical aid costs. Number 8. Brandon Spencer. Brandon Spencer was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison back in 2014 for a shooting that wounded 4 people at a Halloween party. The incident occurred about 2 years before sentencing on the University of South Carolina campus. Brandon was overwhelmed with emotion during the sentencing, and he pounded his forehead twice on the desk in court while the judge read the sentence for his conviction on 4 counts. The sheriff's deputies gathered around Brandon as he sobbed following an extremely emotional court appearance. Back in February 2014, he was convicted and shouted expletives. Before his sentence was announced, Brandon's attorney pleaded that the judge grant leniency. He said, "Many people have come down here today in support of Brandon. The court is able to look at the rap sheet of the defendant. The rap sheet speaks of poor choices that the defendant has made in the past." He also asked the judge to consider the totality of person's life, noting that Brandon was employed as a security guard working towards attending college in the future. The prosecution, on the other hand, portrayed Brandon as a criminal with gang ties and used tweets that had been sent from his phone as evidence. The jurors were informed that Brandon was a documented, well-known gang member. He had also been shot in the stomach in August 2011 by an unidentified rival gang member. The deputy district attorney said that Brandon was seeking vengeance when he fired at a reputed gang member named Gino Hall outside the party at USC. Brandon and Hall allegedly had an ongoing feud over social media that was fueled by their gang rivalry. Number 9. Dylan Schumacher. The 16-year-old Dylan Schumacher admitted to taking the life of a nearly 2-year-old toddler in March 2013. Dan was babysitting Austin, who is Dan, and his 3-month-old brother during the night when he took the life of the little boy. During his trial in court, Schumacher cried and apologized to the victim's mother. He said that he didn't mean to hurt Austin. However, the little boy's mother, Ashley, refused to accept his apology. She was Dylan's girlfriend, and on the day of the incident, she was working. Dylan allegedly assaulted the child and head-whipped him before taking his life. Blood vessels in his brain burst to cause internal bleeding. Dylan told the court that he did not intend for this to happen. However, the Supreme Court and Ashley, who held him responsible for the toddler's demise, dismissed his excuses. He was found guilty by the court and was given the harshest sentence possible. He received a 25-year life term. The session was described by the Supreme Court justice as heartbreaking. He asserted that a person can recognize right from wrong at the age of 16. The Supreme Court justice observed that Dylan was aware of what would happen if he assaulted the child. Dylan is currently serving his sentence in the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State and is scheduled for parole in 2031. His sentence was reduced in February 2016 by the appeals court. Since the judge lowered his sentence to 18 years, he can seek release after serving those 18 years. Number 10. Heather Opel. Heather Opel was just 13 years old when she helped take a life of an old man. According to court documents, Heather, along with her 14-year-old friend Marion Oliver, 17-year-old Jeffrey Grote, and 14-year-old Kyle Boston, was paid by Barbara Opel to assault a man she had problems with. The teenagers ambushed the victim and took his life. Heather Opel and Marion Oliver were sentenced to 22 years in prison. Jeffrey Grote received a 50-year sentence and Kyle Boston was given 18 years. Barbara Opel received a life sentence for arranging the whole ordeal. Relatives of the elderly victim confronted Heather in court. His daughter, Colleen Muller, said Heather Opel says she deserves a chance for the future. I ask why. Life in prison is what she deserves. The victim's daughter also noted that Heather willingly participated in the group execution after living under Heineman's roof, eating his food and accepting his Christmas presents. Prosecuting attorneys asked for a 25-year-old sentence, but the Snohomish County Superior Court judge issued a sentence of 22 years, the mandated minimum with no time off for good behavior. With credit for time already served, Opel became one of the youngest defendants to ever face charges as an adult in the county. Opel waived her rights to a jury trial in an agreement worked out with prosecutors in order to avoid a more serious charge. Number 11. Stuart Harling. Stuart Harling was 18 years old when he ambushed the 33-year-old Cheryl Moss. The trainee accountant assaulted the nurse while she was taking a cigarette break in the rear of St. George Hospital, Hornchurch, Essex, back in 2012. Police reports revealed that the serial criminal-obsessed teenager would have done it again if he hadn't been caught. Harling was given a life sentence by the court and was told that he had to serve a minimum of 20 years. The teenager from Blake Close, Raynham, Essex, was found guilty in March 2012 and remained in custody for sentencing. After the trial was over, Detective Chief Inspector told the press, "I have no doubt that if Harling had not been arrested, he would have gone on to commit other crimes." The victim's husband said, "We are all glad that this evil person was caught quickly so that no one else had to lose their life, as this was very likely." Harling had to spend hours researching serial criminals on the internet. He fantasized about violent crimes and wrote a blog about taking the life of a black woman on Upminster Bridge. Unfortunately, Mrs. Moss became his victim when it was time for him to turn his sick fantasy into reality. Number 12. John Silva. The 15-year-old John Silva was convicted of a first-degree crime for taking the life of a 12-year-old whose body was recovered from a dry septic tank pit 2 days after he disappeared. Silva was tried as an adult and was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for taking the life of young Jerry Lee Alley Jr. It took the jury less than 2 hours to deliberate and declare Silva guilty. The 12 jurors had the option of considering a second-degree count. John Silva's mother and sister cried when the verdict was announced and began sobbing heavily as the judge continued speaking. Jerry Lee's grandparents, Marlon and Ann Alley, hugged Cynthia Silva after the jury that convicted her son was dismissed. Marlon Alley said, "I'm just sorry we both lost sons to this. It's a shame. This didn't have to happen at all." The assistant district attorney said the punishment was appropriate and would prevent Silva from hurting anyone else ever again. But Silva's attorney told the court that there were too many unanswered questions to find Silva guilty of such horrendous crime. Silva showed no reaction to the sentence. He was tried and sentenced as an adult. Number 13, Eddie Devine. Eddie Devine is the Jackson teenager who was sentenced to a whopping 130 years in prison. The 17-year-old had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of armed carjacking, 3 counts of armed robbery, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 2 counts of battery. The charges against him stemmed from incidents reported on April 2013, March 2014, and April 2014. In the case, Devine and Remy Harvey, who was just 13, were accused of forcing a woman into her car inside a Jackson apartment complex and assaulting her using an ice pick. The incident happened at the Hallmark Gardens apartments on Northside Drive. According to reports, the woman was able to escape when the 2 boys stopped for gas after driving around for a while. The father of one of his victims said, "The daughter I got back after that incident is not the same girl that I brought into this world. She is not. She is afraid." Devine was arrested by Flowood police in December 2014. He was sentenced to 30 years for assault, 30 years for armed robbery, and 30 years for kidnapping in a Hinds County court. His day-for-day sentences will run concurrently according to the judge. Number 14, Gregory Brooks. An elderly Northwest Indiana couple was assaulted and their bodies were dumped in a forest preserve back in 2009. The heinous crime was committed by Gregory Brooks Jr. and an accomplice. The bodies of Ruby and Milton McClendon were discovered in October 2009 around 2 miles from their home in a Calumet City Forest Preserve. They had been robbed at their home and their house had been ransacked. The 2 suspects pleaded guilty. One of them was 19-year-old Gregory Brooks Jr., who was sentenced to 120 years in prison. The defendant's father, Gregory Brooks Sr., said he tried to keep his son away from gangs but failed. The other suspect was Rio Jonta Thompson, who was only 17. Prosecutors alleged that Brooks and Thompson attacked the McClendons and stole $50 in cash, a rifle, jewelry, and other items, after which they locked the couple in a closet. Later on, they forced them into the trunk and drove them to the forest and took their lives. The 2 defendants were witnessed by several people driving around in the stolen Cadillac Eldorado that belonged to the McClendons. Number 15, Kavosiey Sims. Kavosiey Sims was just 15 years old when he assaulted and took the lives of 2 other teenagers in 2015. Sims was sentenced to 70 to 120 years in prison by Douglas County District Court judge. He had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second degree in the deaths of James Starr and Brandon Phelps. Sims had gone to buy a firearm from Starr outside Ernie Chambers Court Apartments near 16th and Yates Street in December 2015. When he realized he was possibly being robbed, Sims pulled out a weapon and assaulted both the teenagers. With good time, Kavosiey will have to serve 35 years before he is eligible for parole. His attorney argued that the young boy panicked when he realized that one of the teenagers had a gun. Sims told the judge that he was sorry about everything that happened and everything that went down. He said that he didn't want any of this to happen. James Martin Davis, Sims' attorney, asked for a minimum sentence of 20 years to life. He said that Sims was a 15-year-old who panicked. There was no intent to do this. He's had minor trouble since he was 12 or 13. He didn't have a father figure to raise him. Like so many kids out there, his role models were the people on the streets.